she ruled the business world with an iron fist, dismissing those she deemed beneath her. But when a quiet, overlooked entrepreneur stepped forward, he didn't just challenge her. He shattered her empire with a $5 billion deal, proving that real power lies not in exclusion, but in lifting others up. Before dive in, let us know from where you are watching. We love to know your thoughts. Stay tuned, you won't believe what happens next. It was an ordinary morning in an extraordinary setting, a prestigious global conference, where business moguls, world leaders, and the elite of every industry gathered to exchange groundbreaking ideas. The atmosphere was electric, filled with the hum of anticipation and sharp minds eager to redefine the future. At the center of it all was one woman, the billionaire who had built her empire from the ground up. She was known for her cutthroat strategies, unyielding determination, and ability to manipulate markets like a chessboard. But today, she was about to make a declaration that would not only shock the room but also send ripples through the business world. With her perfectly tailored suit, piercing gaze, and an air of authority, she stepped onto the stage. The crowd fell silent. The spotlight illuminated her, casting a powerful aura around her as she addressed the audience. She spoke confidently, rattling off market predictions and unveiling ambitious future projects. Everything seemed poised for greatness until she reached the part about personal interactions. Without skipping a beat, she looked directly at the staff standing near the stage and made a cold, sharp statement that caused the air to freeze. "I don't shake hands with staff," she declared, her voice carrying across the room. The words hung in the air like a bombshell, echoing off the walls as the room buzzed with unease. The billionaire's declaration was as stunning as it was uncomfortable. It was a statement of power, clear, unyielding, and undeniably exclusive. The staff, who had spent hours preparing for the event, looked at each other in disbelief. Was this truly happening? In a room full of powerful people, why was she singling out the staff with such disdain? To the outsider, it might have seemed like a mere slip of the tongue. But to those who understood the dynamics of power, it was a clear message. She didn't need to play nice with the little people. The staff were beneath her, mere pawns in her grand game. And yet, as her cold words hung in the air, little did she know that within minutes, her entire narrative was about to be rewritten. The story of the billionaire's detached superiority was about to collide with a force of nature that would forever change the course of the day, and perhaps her legacy. As the room still simmered with the billionaire's biting words, all eyes were on the figure who had just stepped forward. The crowd's attention shifted, curiosity piqued by the man who was walking confidently to the front. He was not the usual type of entrepreneur who would command such a spotlight. His appearance wasn't marked by expensive suits or the flashy brand names that most business magnates wore. Instead, he exuded an unassuming yet powerful presence. He was a black man, someone who had carved his path in a world that often underestimated people like him. His journey hadn't been paved with privilege or easy opportunities. In fact, it had been the complete opposite. Raised in a working class neighborhood where dreams were often deferred and opportunities were scarce, he had learned to navigate a world that seemed set against him. But instead of succumbing to the harshness of his environment, he used it as fuel to propel himself forward. He had faced every form of adversity: racism, lack of access to capital, and skepticism from those who believed his background disqualified him from greatness. But he never let these barriers define him. This man was not an overnight success. His rise was a slow burn, years of tireless effort, of learning from failure, and of using his experiences as stepping stones. He had founded a tech company that was revolutionizing industries by creating solutions that addressed problems most people ignored. From coding in his small apartment to building a global network, he had transformed his passion into a multi-billion-dollar enterprise. But more than just a businessman, he was a pioneer. He had a vision that went beyond profit. He wanted to create systems that elevated the marginalized, providing opportunities to communities often ignored by the powers that be. In the world of tech and business, he was known for disrupting the status quo. His companies were more than just profitable. They were game changers, pushing the boundaries of what was considered possible. And now, as the billionaire stood at the front of the room, her words still echoing in the minds of the attendees, he was ready to make his move. Without saying a word, the man walked toward the stage, exuding quiet strength. He didn't need to boast, to flaunt his wealth or power. He had done something far more important. He had secured a $5 billion deal, one that would change the course of history. The deal wasn't just a financial transaction, it was a statement. It was a victory. Not only for him, but for all those who had been overlooked by an elitist system. His move was precise and calculated. The billionaire, who had once ruled with an iron fist, now stood before a man who had just proven that sometimes the greatest power lies in what you can achieve without ever having to ask for permission. And in that moment, the room witnessed something extraordinary. The future of business was no longer about who you knew or how much money you had. It was about vision, determination, and most importantly, the courage to rewrite the rules. The billionaire stood frozen, her eyes locked on the man who had just sealed a deal worth $5 billion. The warmth of the spotlight that once illuminated her confident demeanor now felt cold and distant. She had been the queen of the room, her sharp business strategies making waves in the market. But in this moment, everything seemed to unravel in front of her. The tension in the room was palpable as the crowd, sensing the shift in power, held its collective breath. Her statement about not shaking hands with staff had been an ill-advised expression of superiority, one that reinforced the rigid hierarchy she had built her empire on. It had been a move designed to demonstrate dominance, to set herself apart from the common folk. But in the blink of an eye, her cold words were now biting her back in ways she hadn't anticipated. The man, calm and composed, had just, done what many thought impossible. He had pulled off a $5 billion deal. And it wasn't just the size of the transaction that left the room in awe, it was the message behind it. His move was a reminder that power in business didn't have to come at the expense of others. He had earned his success through determination, innovation, and a relentless commitment to inclusivity, something the billionaire had overlooked in her moment of arrogance. The billionaire's mind raced. She had spent years building a reputation as an industry giant, someone who didn't need to lower herself to the ordinary people in the room. But here she was, facing the harsh reality that her tactics of exclusion and elitism had made her a target for a man who had just proven that success didn't belong to those who looked down on others. Her pride, built on years of calculated maneuvering and strategic advantage, was now staring her in the face. The contrast between them was stark. He was not a self-proclaimed titan. He wasn't broadcasting his wealth or power to intimidate. In fact, the man didn't need to boast or even draw attention to his accomplishments. His deal, signed with quiet confidence, spoke for itself. Meanwhile, she, despite all her wealth and status, had stumbled into a moment of deep vulnerability. As the realization set in, the billionaire's once unshakable confidence began to crack. She had thought herself untouchable, immune to challenges. But now she was faced with a harsh truth: her exclusionary practices had made her vulnerable. In the very system she had built, the man before her, who had once been disregarded by those like her, had just proven that real power was not about control, but about building something that lifted others along with you. The room, once filled with admiration for her, now held a mixture of awe and disbelief. What had seemed like a display of superiority now looked like an act of profound weakness. The billionaire had learned a hard lesson. No matter how high you climb, the fall can come swiftly if you forget the value of those beneath you. The power dynamics in the room had shifted, and with it, the future of business itself. It wasn't about who was in charge. It was about who understood the true meaning of influence, humility, respect, and the ability to lift others to new heights. And in that moment, the man who had come from nothing was the one who had all the power, while the billionaire, for the first time, was forced to reckon with her own ego. The billionaire stood silently, her mind spinning in a whirlwind of disbelief. What had just transpired was more than a simple business negotiation. It was a turning point. The magnitude of the $5 billion deal that had unfolded before her was not the only thing that left her speechless. It was the fact that the very people she had consistently looked down upon, the staff, the marginalized communities, those who did not have the elite credentials, were now in a position of undeniable power. As the crowd in the room began to stir, cameras flashing and media personnel scrambling to capture every second, the ripple effects of this moment started to unfold across the globe. It wasn't just a shocking incident for those who had witnessed it in person. It was a moment that was destined to change the course of business for years to come. The billionaire had unknowingly become the face of something much larger than herself, the backlash against a world that had long been run by exclusionary tactics, elitism, and the idea that power was meant for the select few. The media was quick to pick up on the contrast between the billionaire's cold stance and the unassuming yet powerful entrepreneur who had just pulled off a $5 billion deal. Headlines quickly appeared across the globe, highlighting the stark differences between the two individuals. The billionaire's words, once seen as a sign of dominance, were now a symbol of the systemic barriers that had long existed in the business world. She had made the mistake of assuming that power could be wielded without consequence. That status could be maintained by looking down on those who were beneath her. But the world was no longer buying into that narrative. The man who had secured the deal became an instant hero. He was celebrated not just for the financial success of his venture, but for the way he had disrupted the traditional power structures in business. People began to look at him as a symbol of what was possible when one refused to be limited by the boundaries set by an elitist society. His story, one of perseverance and defying the odds, was shared across social media, news outlets, and boardrooms. He wasn't just a successful entrepreneur. He was a beacon of change, representing the future of business, one that wasn't built on old-world power, but on innovation, inclusivity, and respect for others. But it wasn't just the media that was taking note of this moment. Industry leaders, from CEOs to government officials, began to reevaluate the way they had been conducting business. The billionaire's mistake had sparked a broader conversation about exclusionary practices in the corporate world. How many times had companies risen to power by sidelining those who didn't fit the mold? How often had the traditional business elite turned a blind eye to the untapped potential of marginalized communities? The answer was clear, and it was time for change. Within days of the event, new discussions began to unfold within boardrooms across the world. Business leaders who had long resisted change now found themselves questioning their own practices. Many began to realize that the success of the future would be determined not by maintaining rigid power structures, but by embracing diversity, fostering inclusion, and creating pathways for those who had been overlooked. The $5 billion deal had done more than just break records. It had broken the mold. It had proven that true power in business didn't reside with those who clung to their status, but with those who understood the value of uplifting others. For the billionaire, the realization was painful. She had spent her life building a fortress of power and influence, surrounded by yes-men and a carefully curated circle of like-minded elites. But in that brief moment, everything she had worked for came crashing down. Her carefully crafted image as the queen of industry had been exposed for what it truly was, a construct built on exclusion, not merit. The man who had just secured the $5 billion deal had done so not by relying on his wealth or privilege, but by lifting others and showing the world that success is not a zero-sum game. He had turned the tables not just in business, but in the very structure of society. As the weeks passed, the consequences of this moment continued to reverberate through the business world. Companies that had once looked at diversity as a checkbox began to implement real changes. New policies were enacted to ensure fair representation and equal opportunities for all. A new era of leadership began to take shape, one where leaders were expected not only to drive profits, but to drive social change. And in the midst of it all stood the man who had quietly reshaped the narrative, showing that true leadership isn't about who you exclude, but about who you bring along with you. For the billionaire, the road ahead would be marked by reflection. She would have to reckon with her own legacy and the world she had helped to build. In the years to come, she might reflect on the moment when everything changed, when the power dynamics shifted, and when the world realized that true business greatness isn't defined by wealth alone, it's defined by the impact you have on those around you. In the end, the billionaire had learned a lesson she would never forget. Power, no matter how seemingly uncheckable, could slip through your fingers if you weren't careful. And this time, it had slipped right into the hands of someone who had been underestimated by the very system that had elevated her. As the weeks passed, the shocking event of the billionaire's cold words and the ensuing $5 billion deal continued to dominate headlines. What had started as a moment of arrogance and exclusion had spiraled into a global conversation about power, opportunity, and the future of business itself. For the billionaire, the immediate fallout was harsh. Her reputation had been tarnished, and her business empire faced an uncertain future. But the true test of her legacy was yet to come. Would she learn from her mistake, or would she double down on her old ways? The man who had pulled off the $5 billion deal, on the other hand, found himself in the spotlight in ways he had never anticipated. His name, once known only in niche circles of the tech world, was now synonymous with change, innovation, and the new face of business leadership. His victory wasn't just financial. It was symbolic of a shift that was beginning to take place across industries. He had not only demonstrated how one could rise to the top through merit and determination, but he had also proven that the future of business didn't belong to those who hoarded power, but to those who knew how to share it. The ripple effect of his success was felt far and wide. Investors, business owners, and industry leaders who had previously turned a blind eye to underrepresented communities now found themselves questioning their own biases. The realization began to sink in that there was more value in inclusivity than in exclusivity. The world was no longer just about the billionaire's cold strategies. It was about building relationships, empowering others, and fostering innovation in places where it had long been stifled. But even as the man's influence grew, he remained grounded. He didn't chase the fame or adulation that came with being thrust into the global spotlight. Instead, he focused on expanding his business, forging partnerships with like-minded individuals, and continuing his mission to disrupt the status quo. His $5 billion deal was just the beginning. He had bigger plans that would reshape entire industries, creating a more equitable and accessible future for all. The work that lay ahead was not about personal gain. It was about building a legacy of change that would last long after the cameras stopped flashing. The billionaire, however, wasn't so easily forgotten. While her actions had created a scandal, they had also prompted a deep reflection within the business world about what truly defines a leader. Her empire, once uncheckable, now stood at a crossroads. She had built her success on the belief that power was something to be hoarded and controlled. But the $5 billion deal, secured by someone from the very communities she had excluded, had proved her wrong. The billionaire was now faced with a critical question. Could she adapt to the changing times, or would she continue to defend a broken system that valued exclusivity over inclusion? In the weeks that followed, whispers began circulating that the billionaire was considering a major shift in her approach. The growing pressure from industry leaders, investors, and the public was undeniable. Many speculated that she might embrace diversity and inclusion in her companies, recognizing that the future of business was no longer defined by who held the most wealth, but by who was willing to lead with empathy, vision, and social responsibility. Could she shed her old ways and learn from the man who had just redefined what true power in business looked like? For her part, the billionaire began to make changes. She initiated new policies to address diversity within her company, offering mentorship to underrepresented groups and opening up channels for fresh ideas from people who had once been ignored. But it was clear to everyone watching that these changes were born out of necessity, not a genuine desire for change. Many felt that her transformation was born not of personal growth but of sheer survival. The real question was whether she could ever truly change her mindset after decades of believing in a system that rewarded her for pushing others down. The world watched, eager to see how the billionaire would respond to the shifting tide. Would she continue to hold on to her empire with an iron grip? Or would she accept that the future of business had already been rewritten by a man who had pulled off the unthinkable and walked away with $5 billion in support? Only time would tell. But one thing was clear. The age of exclusionary power was coming to an end. The man who had emerged victorious was not just a business success story. He was a symbol of the future where success was defined not by who you could shut out, but by who you could bring along with you. As the billionaire reflected on her legacy, she understood that the world had changed in a way that could never be undone. The power she had once wielded was no longer a solitary force, it was now a collective strength, one that belonged to those who knew how to lift others, not just themselves. And for the first time in her career, she realized that her greatest challenge was not competing with others, but learning how to lead in a world where everyone had the potential to rise. As the dust settled and the world watched, the billionaire, once the untouchable queen of her empire, found herself at a crossroads facing the very system she had built, now crumbling under the weight of its own exclusivity. The $5 billion deal had not just changed one man's life. It had reshaped the entire landscape of business. It was a powerful reminder that true success isn't just about wealth or power, it's about how you use that power to uplift others and create a future that's not defined by who you leave behind, but by who you bring along. The man who had pulled off the unthinkable, standing tall in a world that once underestimated him, had proven that the future belonged to those who dared to break the mold, challenge the status quo, and lead with purpose. His journey wasn't just about money, it was about shifting the narrative, and in doing so, he had not only won a deal but a victory for every person who had ever been overlooked, dismissed, or underestimated. In the end, the billionaire learned that power is fleeting, but true influence comes from the ability to inspire change, to lift others as you climb, and to lead with humility, respect, and vision. As the world turned its gaze toward the horizon, one thing was certain: the age of exclusivity was over, and the future belonged to those who had the courage to embrace inclusivity, to lead with heart, and to change the world, one deal at a time.